Hi, my name is Stanley, and this is Old Money Life, the show where we pull back the velvet curtain on the families that built empires, inherited kingdoms, and occasionally lost everything that money could never actually protect. Today we're telling a story that has stayed with me since I first came across it. It's not about a fortune won or lost. It's about a young man born into one of the most legendary dynasties America has ever produced. A man who was brilliant, sensitive, and by every account destined for something remarkable. Who was gone before he ever had the chance to find out what that something was. This is the tragic life of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper. The weight of the Vanderbilt name. When you hear the name Vanderbilt in 2025, you likely think of one thing: Anderson Cooper, the silver-haired CNN anchor who seems to have been a permanent fixture of American television since approximately the beginning of time. But before Anderson, before the broadcasting career and the Grief podcast and the best-selling book about his own family, there was Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, the older brother, the other last heir. And to understand what Carter's life meant and what his death cost, you first have to understand the sheer gravitational force of the name he was born into. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the brother's great-great-grandfather, is one of those figures in American history so outsized that he almost stops feeling real. Born to a modest family on Staten Island in 1794, Cornelius clawed his way from ferrying passengers across New York Harbor as a teenager to commanding the largest transportation empire the country had ever seen. By the time he pivoted from steamboats to railroads in the 1860s, acquiring the New York and Harlem Railroad, the Hudson River Railroad, and eventually the sprawling New York Central Railroad, he had built a network that stitched the American economy together. People called him the Commodore, and not affectionately. He was ruthless, unyielding, and almost pathologically competitive. By his death in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated a fortune estimated at $95 million. Adjusted for inflation, that figure sits somewhere north of $140 billion today. He was, at the time of his passing, the single wealthiest man in the United States. Wealthier than the Rockefellers, wealthier than anyone. His descendants did what Gilded Age heirs tend to do with incomprehensible wealth. They built mansions along Fifth Avenue that made European royalty raise an eyebrow. Summer palaces in Newport, Rhode Island. And of course, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, still the largest private home in America in 2025, a 253-room French Renaissance chateau that required an army of staff simply to keep the lights on. The Vanderbilts were not merely rich, they were a symbol in American mythology, a shorthand for everything extravagant and aspirational and slightly absurd about what this country does when it has too much money and not quite enough restraint. And it was into this mythology, this crushing, glittering, impossible legacy, that Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was born. Gloria Vanderbilt, the mother who was also a wound. To understand Carter, you must first understand his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, because Gloria's story is the foundation upon which everything else is built, and it is not a particularly stable one. Gloria Vanderbilt entered the world in 1924, the daughter of Reginald Vanderbilt, a man who had managed to burn through much of his considerable inheritance before dying of liver failure when Gloria was just 17 months old. She was, from her first breath, an heiress, the beneficiary of a $5 million trust fund, worth over $80 million in today's terms, that she would not control for years, and the people who wanted to control it for her would wage one of the most spectacular legal battles in American history to do so. The 1934 custody trial over young Gloria was dubbed the trial of the century by the press, which tells you something about how dramatically America has always consumed the private agonies of its wealthiest families. Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was painted in court as a socialite more interested in European nightlife than in her daughter's welfare. Her aunt, the sculptor and socialite Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, ultimately won custody, reducing Gloria's mother to occasional visits. The child Gloria grew up understanding her own mother as, in her words, a beautiful stranger. Think about that for a moment. A beautiful stranger. That's not a description. That's a wound dressed up as a sentence. Gloria survived, more than survived, actually. She remade herself repeatedly and with considerable flair. She became an artist, an actress, a writer, a fashion pioneer whose designer jeans in the 1970s generated $10 million in royalties in a single year. She married 4 times, accumulated, and shed identities the way other women change handbags. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she fell deeply and genuinely in love with a Mississippi-born writer named Wyatt Emery Cooper. Wyatt was everything Gloria's world was not: grounded, quietly principled, warm in a way that old money households rarely permit. He had grown up poor in the Deep South, had carved out a respectable career as a writer and actor through sheer talent, and when he met Gloria at a New York dinner party in the early 1960s, he saw past the Vanderbilt mythology to the woman underneath it, who was still in many ways that little girl looking for a family that would actually stay. They married on Christmas Eve 1963. For Gloria, it was the definitive love of her life. For their sons, it would be the one great gift and the one great loss. Carter and Anderson, brotherhood under glass. Carter, Vanderbilt. Carter and Anderson, brotherhood under glass. Carter, Vanderbilt. Cooper was born in 1965. Anderson followed in 1967, and whatever image you have in your mind of a privileged Manhattan childhood in the 1970s, I want you to dial it up considerably. The family lived on the Upper East Side in an apartment with views that most New Yorkers spend their entire lives dreaming about. Icons like Diane Arbus photographed the boys as infants. Not exactly your standard baby album situation. Anderson famously appeared on The Tonight Show at the age of 3, which is either adorable or a harbinger of his entire career, depending on how you look at it. Private schools, private jets, summers abroad, the constant ambient hum of prestige and expectation. The Cooper brothers grew up inside a fishbowl made of gold, and the whole world was watching. But here's the thing about Carter and Anderson that gets lost when you reduce their childhood to a list of privileges. They were, by all accounts, genuinely close. The bond between them was the real thing, forged not just by shared circumstance, but by shared temperament. Anderson has described their relationship with a kind of reverence that you don't perform. These were 2 boys who understood each other in the way only siblings raised under unusual pressure can. They had the same mother, the same apartment, the same impossible surname. But they were, in almost every other way, quite different. Anderson was the extrovert, adaptable, socially capable, the kind of child who could navigate a room full of adults and come out the other side with everyone charmed. Carter was the other kind, quieter, more interior, more, as Anderson once put it, sensitive. Not fragile, sensitive. There is a difference, and it matters enormously to this story. Who was Carter Vanderbilt Cooper? Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a genuinely remarkable mind. His intellectual passions were specific and deep in the way that marks someone who is actually thinking rather than simply performing the act of it. He was captivated by military history, by politics, by the great machinery of how power moves through the world and across generations. There is something quietly poignant about that, given the dynasty he was born into. Already, he attended Princeton University, graduating in 1987. And Princeton, I should note, is not the sort of institution that tolerates intellectual passengers. Carter was not there to trade on his name. He was there to learn, and by all evidence, he did exactly that. After graduation, he began contributing book reviews and editorial work to American Heritage magazine, a publication dedicated to American history, which suited him perfectly. This was not a young man in search of a party. This was a young man in search of understanding. His friends and family described him as deeply empathetic, the kind of person who absorbed other people's emotions like a sponge and felt the weight of the world with an intensity that was both his greatest gift and his most significant burden. He had a peculiar, almost philosophical fear of anesthetics, a dread of being rendered unconscious, of losing the thread of his own experience. Anderson later reflected on this as Carter's fierce desire to live fully and consciously, to feel everything, rather than numb any of it away. In a family and a social world built on surfaces and performance and the careful management of appearances, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was constitutionally incapable of pretending. And then there was the question of what he was supposed to become, because the Vanderbilt name does not sit quietly on your shoulders. It makes demands. It arrives at every dinner party before you do. It answers questions you haven't been asked yet. For Anderson, who built his own identity through decades of relentless professional achievement, the name eventually became something he could stand alongside rather than beneath. For Carter, who was still in the early chapters of figuring out who he was and what he wanted to build, the weight of it was something else entirely. The darkness always the truth i thy skin. The darkness behind the dynasty. The first great rupture in Carter's life came when he was 10 years old. Wyatt Cooper, the father who had given both boys their moral center, their sense of groundedness, their connection to something real beneath all the Vanderbilt marble and silk. Wyatt Cooper died of heart disease in 1978. He was 50 years old, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because 10 years old is a particularly merciless age to lose the parent who made the world feel safe. You are old enough to understand exactly what has happened. You are not old enough to have any useful framework for surviving it. Gloria was devastated in the way that people who have already survived one foundational abandonment are devastated by a second, which is to say, completely. The family that Wyatt had held together by sheer force of warmth and decency now had to find a new center of gravity. And for two boys growing up in a Manhattan apartment with a grieving mother and a legendary surname, that was not a straightforward task. Carter carried the loss inward, the way sensitive people do. He continued excelling, continued reading, continued building the interior life that defined him. But the absence of Wyatt Cooper is impossible to separate from what came later. Grief, when it is absorbed young enough and deeply enough, has a way of reshaping the architecture of a person from the inside. By the mid-1980s, Carter was dealing with severe physical ailments as well. Debilitating allergies that compromised his quality of life in ways that are easy to underestimate if you have never experienced a serious chronic illness. In the months before July 1988, a new asthma inhaler had been prescribed to manage his respiratory difficulties. Gloria would later come to believe, with the kind of conviction that only a mother searching desperately for an explanation can sustain, that this medication triggered a fatal psychotic episode in her son. The medical record is not conclusive. The grief absolutely is. July 22nd, 1988. July 22nd, 1988. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was 23 years old. Gloria was at home. The apartment was on the 14th floor. There are details here that I will not linger on, because some moments deserve to be described with restraint rather than spectacle, and this is one of them. What happened is this. Gloria watched her son move toward the terrace. She pleaded with him to step back. Her words did not reach him. And then he was gone. 23 years old. Princeton graduate, historian, book reviewer, beloved brother. Gone. There is a particular category of tragedy that resists the kind of neat narrative framing that we use to make sense of loss. The tragedy that arrives without warning, without a villain, without a clear through line of cause and effect that the mind can follow to some place of resolution. Carter's death belongs in that category. It does not resolve, it simply happened, and then the world continued, and the people who loved him had to figure out how to continue with it. Gloria, who had already lost her father before she could walk, lost her mother to a courtroom, and lost her husband to his heart. Gloria now lost her son in the most immediate and irreversible way imaginable. She was a spectator to it. That detail is almost too much to absorb. The aftermath. A family remade by loss. In the wake of July 22nd, two things happened simultaneously. Gloria Vanderbilt fell apart, and then she rebuilt herself around the loss with the kind of fierce, creative determination that had carried her through every previous catastrophe. She wrote about Carter. She kept him alive in conversation, in art, in memory. Her book on the subject, written as a direct address to her dead son, is one of the rawest documents of maternal grief in American literary history. She did not perform recovery, she excavated it. Anderson Cooper, 20 years old when his brother died, did something different with the same loss. He turned outward. He has said explicitly in interviews and in his grief podcast All There Is, which he launched in 2022, that Carter's death was the force that drove him toward journalism, toward bearing witness to other people's losses, toward standing in the middle of the world's worst moments and refusing to look away. When you watch Anderson Cooper cover a natural disaster or a mass casualty event, but that particular quality of contained, unflinching attention he brings to human suffering, you are watching, at least in part, a man who learned very young what it costs to look away. The podcast is worth mentioning because it is, in many ways, Anderson's most direct public reckoning with Carter's absence. Episode after episode, he sits with guests who have experienced profound loss and asks them the questions he has been asking himself for over 30 years. What do you do with grief that never resolves? How do you carry someone who is no longer there to carry themselves? The show has resonated with millions of people, which tells you something important. That Carter Vanderbilt Cooper's death, private and painful and belonging entirely to one family, rippled outward into something that has given other people language for their own losses. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. So, what do we make of the life of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper? He was not a titan of industry. He did not build an empire or lose one. He did not marry into royalty or divorce out of a dynasty. By the metrics this channel usually traffics in, his story is brief and quietly lived and ends before it properly begins. But that, I think, is precisely the point. The Vanderbilt story is usually told as an ascent. Railroad barons, Fifth Avenue palaces, the largest private home in America. Carter's story is the reminder that behind every legendary surname there are actual human beings, carrying actual weight, trying to figure out who they are beneath the marble and the mythology. And sometimes the weight is too much, and the person underneath it is too young, and the world loses someone it did not know it needed. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper deserved more time. That's the whole story, really. He deserved more time. I'm Stanley. This has been Old Money Life. Onks, if Carter's story moved you, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which family's forgotten heir should we cover next? Thank you, as always, for spending your time here. Cheers, until next time.